was a young teenager, around 13 or 14. My cousin Judy and her family had rented a home on the Tennessee and Georgia line. This was a huge house with plenty of bedrooms for Judy and her 4 siblings. It had a wraparound porch and 3 fireplaces. It was a gorgeous old home, probably built in the early 1920s, if not earlier. And there were huge oak and maple trees complete with tire swings in the front yard. Judy, who was 2 years older than me, instantly hated that house. She said that it scared her. Her mother passed it off as that adolescent dislike of anything and everything. After about a month in that house, Judy had changed. She was always sleepy and cranky, always jumpy, and looking over her shoulder as if she were scared. When I asked her what was wrong, she insisted that it was the house. She said that there were strange voices, odors, and unexplainable movement from furniture at night, that she was almost unable to sleep at all. When I tried to be rational, she snapped at me and demanded that I go and see for myself. That night, I arrived with a small tape recorder and blank cassette tape, something one of my classmates told me to do, and readied myself for bed. Just after 11 p.m., I awoke to the sound of fingernails tapping rhythmically on a wooden table. Figuring it was just Judy trying to save face, I rolled over and went back to sleep. A short time later, the radio alarm clock sounded, blaring some static-filled rock tune. I turned it off, thinking again that it was just Judy pulling another prank. Later still, I awoke freezing cold. All of the blankets were piled at the foot of the bed. Judy was sitting with her back to the headboard, and her knees curled up under her chin, and her arms wrapped around them. She was staring glazed eyes at the dresser mirror, where there was this faint, fog-like mist reflecting in it. Again, thinking it was all Judy's doing, I gathered up the covers and went back to bed. Finally, very late in the night, I was again awakened to the sound of someone calling my name. It was very distinct and not something Judy could pull off, especially considering she lay next to me sound asleep. I shook her awake, and she heard it too. We sat there listening for what felt like hours. Then it just stopped, and there was an uneasy stillness in the room. The bedroom door slammed shut, and the dresser drawers opened and slammed closed of their own accord. A guttural growling sound filled the entire room, getting louder and louder until it was echoing throughout the house. When it finally subsided, we could hear beating and knocking on the bedroom door. It took us a few moments to realize that it was Judy's mom trying to get into us. When her mom finally got in, Judy and I were in tears. Somehow the door had locked itself, and it was one of those old locks that require a skeleton key to lock or unlock. Her mom wanted to know what we had been doing to cause such a ruckus. When we began to tell her about all of the odd events, she shushed us and emphatically stated that there are no such things going on in this house. No sooner she had gotten the words out of her mouth, the rocking chair in the living room just outside of Judy's bedroom began rocking. Rocking so violently that it was pounding the floor. After that, the kitchen and living room lights began to flicker on and off. Judy and her family moved from the house the very next day. The day after Judy and her family moved, one of her brothers found the tape recorder and began listening to the tape. There were at least 3 different voices heard, and no one could decipher what languages the voices were speaking in. Judy threw that tape in a brush fire after listening to it, and said that those sounds were the sounds she had been hearing since day 1. On a side note, that tape recorder never worked again. When my dad took it to a repair shop, they could not find a thing wrong with it. It simply would not work. I'd forgotten about that night in that house until this past weekend. My spouse and I were driving around looking for a place to hunt when we stopped at a 4-way stop. A chill came over me, and my feet began to burn as if I was suddenly standing on hot coals. I felt lightheaded, nauseous, and weak when he said, "Man, look at that house. It's like staring at us." Gives me the heebie-jeebies. When I looked to my left, there it was, like a nightmarish blast from a long-forgotten past. I called Judy when we got home and told her about seeing that old house. Judy, now almost 35, was extremely upset about the mention of that house. She made it very clear that she did not want to discuss that house or anything that went on beyond its doors, and she made me swear to never bring it up to her ever again. From 2001 to 2003, my grandma and I lived in a house in Boonville, Missouri. The house was my uncle's, but it used to be a duplex, so my grandma had one side, he had the other, and I had the upstairs that went from his side up. First, I have to say that the house always felt weird. It used to be a vet's office, and between the two halves of the house, there's a little hallway about 3.5 feet long with a door on her side, a door on his side, and a door to the basement. The doors in the house stuck at some times of the year. It wouldn't stay shut the other part of the year. This was the part of the year that they wouldn't stay shut. They just swung all the way open. I went downstairs to go talk to my grandma, and when I went into the hall, both doors slammed shut. The basement door, which always latched very well and stayed latched, started to swing open and stopped at about 1 inch. I know it was about 1 inch because my hand was on the door. There was a really cold draft coming from the crack in the door, and our basement wasn't that cold around that time of year. I screamed and started banging and pushing on all 3 doors. It was pitch black in there. There wasn't a light. And finally, the basement door shut quickly, and both doors just swung open. I went in and told my grandma, and she said she heard the door shut and thought it was weird, but didn't hear me screaming. Another time, we had been gone all day, and so had my uncle. We didn't have a big ladder, and no one around there had seen anyone on our roof. I went upstairs and walked into the bathroom, which was right across from a window. I paused for a couple seconds, then turned around. The window, frame and all, were lying on the floor. There were a couple marks on the wall where the corners hit as if it was falling down, and there were linters of wood all over the floor. We checked, and there weren't any pry marks, and no marks outside, and no handprints on the window like someone had pushed it. My uncle still thinks I somehow pried it off the wall. That is the window he kept telling me to keep shut. I tried, but it was one of those windows that opens from the top and leans in. Every time I shut it and locked it, it would come open. He slammed it shut, and the next time it was open was when the window fell off the wall, as we put it. There were other things that happened in that home. Almost all of it happened upstairs. The locked doors would pop unlocked, open, shut, then relock themselves. If I put too many things on top of the filing cabinet in the corner of my bedroom, it would shake violently until some stuff fell off. When anyone went up or down the stairs, something grabbed your ankles about halfway and even tripped you. I had a particularly nasty fall down the stairs one time. The closet doors in the hallway would open and close slowly sometimes. The stairs came up in the middle of the hallway, and there was a walkway all the way around. The side that no one ever walked on had really cold spots. A couple of things that happened that were not upstairs one time. I had my door open and was just laying there thinking, and I saw something come from my upstairs living room and walk down the stairs, ever so slowly. I followed it down the stairs on my rear end so I didn't get tripped, and through to my grandma's side of the house. My grandma started talking when it was still in the shadows. She thought she was still talking to me, and I was still in her kitchen. When I ran in there, she stopped and asked if I was standing there. Who was in the shadows? I told her. That was her first experience with a ghost. Also, All of the time, it seemed that the house was listening and watching everything, even from the outside. All in all, that was a very active house, and I'm glad I don't live there anymore. We moved into our house in August of 2001. We first realized we had a ghost when I was sitting on the toilet and the toilet paper in front of me suddenly and very quickly began to unroll into a perfect pile on the floor. This happened once to my husband also. Soon it began. Here are some of the things we have experienced with our ghost. We have a woman who died in her son's room. Her name is Della. We know this from buying the house from her nephew. And we have a male ghost, but we do not know who he is. Her son will sit in the game room and turn his stereo on. It will turn off. He will get up and turn it back on. It will turn off again. He finally, after a while, gets frustrated and just leaves it off afterwards. Once my husband was plugging in the television in the game room, and he felt a breath on his neck and heard a female voice say, "Too hot." We do not know what she meant by that. Her son was sitting in the upstairs TV room one day. We have a bookshelf in this room. On the top shelf were 2 tall candles and plants. The candle came up over the plants, across the middle of the floor, and hit him on his knee. One evening, my husband and I were the only ones home, and we had heard a crash in the kitchen. One of our glasses had come out of the top cabinet and smashed into the middle of the kitchen floor. One morning we woke up, and the kitchen stool, which had been under the table at the end of the kitchen, was in front of the stove, as if Della had been sitting there, watching something cook. We had several people over, and videotaped the comforter on her bed, being straightened by invisible hands. Also, at this time we asked, "What are you doing here?" A male voice whispered, "Watching." That is when we realized we had not only had Della in this house, but a male ghost as well. We have had on numerous occasions the smell of baking bread, and no one was baking bread. According to her nephew, she died in her son's bedroom in the month of June. The first June that we were there, we had approximately 7 times that the police would call and say that they just received a hung-up 911 call. After a while, we figured out who was doing it and removed the telephone from that room. It never happened again. One summer evening, my husband was in the backyard. When I walked out, he asked, "Where's my beer?" I did not know what he was talking about. He said he thought it was me walking through the kitchen, and he had yelled up for me to bring a beer. I had not been upstairs. I was down in the laundry room. Her son took a picture with his camera cell phone of a dark figure of a man sitting at her desk in front of the computer. We have things like our shoes being upstairs and ending up downstairs, just small things like that being moved. And finally, we can hear someone walking around upstairs when we are downstairs in the game room. It has just become our way of life. They are like part of the family. We don't even consciously notice half of the stuff happening anymore. One of the most horrifying incidents, though, occurred one night while sound asleep. My husband had been sleeping in another room at the time, when I could have sworn I heard faint screams coming from the room he was sleeping in. Although the screams sounded faded and far away, the tone still sounded as if people were being buried alive. Naturally, I rushed to my husband's assistance in the event that he may be in trouble. Fortunately, he was completely fine, but before I could turn back completely and head back into the hallway and into my room, I saw a shadowed figure zip past me from the corner of my eye. I decided, at that point, that I was going to stay with my husband until the morning arrived. I was too scared to go back to the other room, to go back to bed. Hey, my name is Kelly, and I know that this experience is a bit short, but it's also a life-changing story that I'll always remember for the rest of my life. I used to frequently visit this young girl who I became a babysitter for. Her parents' house was a typical American dream type home, nestled inside a friendly subdivision of similar looking homes, with white picket fences, perfectly manicured lawns, etc. One specific occasion, I was watching that girl play around in the front yard. It was late night, and I know it wasn't the smartest thing to do to let a child play around outside in the yard, but I was watching her, and the neighborhood was always very safe. I think it was about 11:30 p.m. at night when this whole event occurred. The streets had been empty. Absolutely nobody was out there but me and this little girl. That was when I noticed a man aimlessly wandering down the street just in front of the house. Since I was so focused on paying attention to the little girl, I didn't really notice him pop into my field of vision until he passed us by. This was an older middle-aged man with tattered clothing, looking completely out of place in a neighborhood that wouldn't even have these types of people wandering on the streets. He looked delirious and was walking slowly. He didn't seem to turn to us or even recognize that we were on the lawn. He just kept walking. Immediately, I grabbed the girl and ran back into the house and locked the door. I decided to look through the drapes when I noticed the man had disappeared on the street. It didn't make much sense to me because the man was walking so slowly and I'd just seen him the second before. I asked the little girl if she'd seen the man I'd seen, and before I could even finish my sentence, I heard a soft knock at my door, my heart pounding. I was too scared to even look through the hole to see if it was that man, but I did anyway. Oddly enough, there was nobody there. I ended up telling the family of the girl, and of course called the cops. They came over and told me to be careful, and that they would do their best to patrol the area in case they see a suspicious man outside. Later on, I thought that it could be possibly a ghost, though I'm not sure, but it does certainly seem like it. Another night I was out playing with this little girl when it started to storm shortly after. Her parents were home this time, but I liked to bond with the kid. My mom called me and told me she wanted me to come home so I wouldn't be out in the middle of the storm. The drive is probably about 10 minutes at the most, back to my house. As a side note, a friend of mine's house that was killed in a car accident is on my way home. As I was driving past, I got this urge to look at the house, and in the yard of this house, there was this fog presence. It wasn't just a light mist either. It was a completely darkened cloud. What completely shocked me, though, was that I swear it had some sort of definition or defined shape. It had the build of a person, but as I said, was still a dark cloud. I saw it for about 5 seconds, then it disappeared. It scared the crap out of me, because nowhere else around had any kind of fog. It definitely seems that this area has a lot of supernatural energy, and I'm not sure why. Thanks for reading, though. I wanted to share a story that proves that love continues, even after death. My son and his wife, who live in another state, were expecting their first baby in the first part of December. My 80-year-old mother couldn't wait for the baby to be born. She was so excited. Every time I talked to her, everything would be about the baby. In mid-October, Mom suddenly fell ill and was hospitalized. My son and his wife came down and spent a lot of time with Mom in the hospital, making plans for the baby, etc. On November 5th, Mom died. My beautiful granddaughter was born December 1st. It was named after her great-granny. It was very bittersweet, as we loved the baby more than anything, and so glad she was healthy. But it was very sad knowing how much Mom wanted to see her. Well, death did not keep Mom from seeing her first great-grandchild. While in the hospital, my daughter-in-law was alone in the room, with the baby, kinda dozing in and out. Suddenly, she felt something nudge the end of her bed. She looked up and saw Mom at the foot of her bed, smiling at her. About this time, the baby started to fuss. My daughter-in-law watched in awe His mom glided across the room to the baby and started rubbing her back. The baby immediately quieted down, and Mom slowly faded away. The baby is now a month old, and my daughter-in-law says that now that they are home, the house will start to feel different, and the baby acts like someone is playing with her. I think we know who her guardian angel is. As a side note, yes, the story is 1000% authentic. I know maybe people might not believe it, but obviously it happened, and I have the proof to back it up, at least in my heart. It's not the scientific proof that everybody wants, but it did happen. I believe in ghosts. I'm certain of it. I had an experience at this location, similar to the gentleman who shared his story, so I'd like to share mine as well. One evening, out of the blue, my friend told me about this haunted track just outside that small Saskatchewan town, located in Canada. We decided to take the several-hour trip just for fun, just to see it. My friend, who knew about it, had already been there several times, and told us exciting but scary stories about it. 2 carloads of us made that trip that wintry night. We drove our vehicles down the track, past some no trespassing barricades, and parked. We got out to look. So to speak, we saw the light. This bright light, similar to a single headlight, slowly moving towards us. We then noticed it would split in 2, move fast, slow down, merge back into one, and repeat at fast rates. Freaked out, we ran back into the cars to leave, to notice the one larger car got stuck in the snow. We tried to get out. The longer and harder we tried, the brighter the light got. We couldn't move the vehicle away from the light because of the snow, but the guys figured we could move it forward, towards the light, unfortunately. Myself and another girl slowly walked towards the light to see if there was a clearing so we could turn around. When we did this, the light seemed to fade away. We walked quite a ways down, then decided to go back to the cars. We turned our backs to the light, which was at this time quite a ways away. You just have to look back, and after a few steps, we did. The light instantly grew in intensity and jumped what was like 50 to 70 feet towards us and was right behind us. We ran to the cars. It followed just as fast. Something, it wasn't the snow, kept making me trip over and over again, hurting my foot even more each time. I was on the verge of tears. Eventually, somehow, we got back into the cars, managed to get turned around, and started heading back. Then the car in front of us got stuck. The light moved up the road with us, but this time, maintained a bit of a distance. We got this car unstuck with less trouble than the first, and proceeded a few meters more when we came back to the barricade. I don't know how we got past it at first. It seemed impossible to get back. Big pieces of metal in the middle of the path, ditch with trees on the side. Maybe just enough to get a car through, if there was light. One of the girls got on top of the pile with a flashlight to show where the edge of that was. I got in the ditch to show where the edge of it was, turned on the headlights, and the most absurd thing happened. The spotlight went crazy, fast, unpredictable movements, sudden duplications, merges, etc. Then little red lights surrounded it as it turned into one huge glowing white light. Then the huge light went out, gone, instantly. The red lights remained, and they flew towards us at high speeds. I tried to get myself out of the ditch and run to the car, but my foot felt as if it was being pulled back by someone. I yelled at the top of my lungs for help, but everyone else was spooked by the red lights, and they were running. More resistance was felt to my ankle, and I looked back at it, and noticed the red little lights now, about a meter from me. I yelled at them to leave me alone, and for my friends to help. All of a sudden, I was released from its stranglehold. I then proceeded to leap from the ditch and ran as fast as I could. I got up and ran as fast as I could to jump in the car. We left and got away from those tracks. I know I yelled. The scary thing was, I asked my friends why they didn't help me get out of the ditch. They said they didn't hear me yell at all for anything. I know I did. Did the ghost take away my voice then and there? Discussing this event afterwards with the group, we concluded I had the scariest experience of the 8 or so of us who took the trip. Why? They aren't sure, but I think I know. I was the one who didn't believe any of it would happen. The ghost had to prove me wrong. They did. Trust me. Believe. They are out there, and you don't want them to have to prove it to you. Every time I tell this story to anyone, even typing it, my body stiffens up like I did that night. I feel a cold sweat, and every shadow scares me. It scared me to tears that night. I returned another time with other friends. They all believed at first, so they ventured out down the path, ran back within seconds, scared out of their wits. I got as far as 5 steps from the car when I jumped back in and locked the doors. Something felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't even look down the path. I traveled 4 hours. Didn't even look again, just to travel another 4 hours back home. Over 35 years ago, in our farm neighborhood, there was a farm where an old woman lived alone. It was said around the neighborhood that the old lady was a witch. I don't know if she actually was a witch, but she was pretty scary looking. She wore long dresses and always had a scarf tied over her head. She walked with a cane and was kinda stooped over looking. She didn't own a car, and we would see her walking up and down the roads, picking up cans and bottles, which I guess she sold. We would pass her in the mornings on the school bus, and whenever the bus went by her, all the kids would quiet down and sit silently in their seats. We wouldn't admit it, but we were scared of her. As I said, she lived on a farm. She did not farm the land, but rather cash rented her ground to another farmer. Land was a mix of ridgeland and rich bottom ground, prime farmland. There was a nice large woods which held an abundance of wildlife. Farmstead itself consisted of a large 2-story farmhouse, 2 barns, and a spring house. Large old pines surrounded the house. It actually was kind of a pretty farm. In 1963, the old lady died alone, and her land was bought by a neighbor in a share of sale. The neighbor was never successful in finding a tenant for the house. It seemed that nobody would live there very long. Then, in 1966, the house and all the outbuildings burned to the ground. The ensuing investigation didn't ever turn up much, but to this day, the rubble of the fires is still there, and the site is slowly going back to nature. Just a large pine still mark where the farm stood. Along came 1967, and for me, life changed. Graduation, the Marines, and Vietnam. Thoughts of witchy-looking old ladies were the furthest from my mind. Presently, after 2 tours, I returned to the good old USA, and for a while, traveled around, seeing the country. Soon, I became homesick and moved back home to Indiana. Having lived in the bush for a couple of years, I guess I had a hard time adjusting to life among people, so I would spend a lot of time in the woods hunting, or just sitting alone, in the quiet. Upon my return home, I asked the owner of the old witch farm if I could hunt on the ground he owned. He responded affirmative, as the ground was no longer good for farming. It seemed that after a couple of years after the old woman died, springs burst forth out of the hillsides in the farm and saturated the bottom ground, ultimately turning the farm into a marsh. Today, you can slog through the marsh and find the tops of fence posts sticking out of the ground for about 10 to 12 inches. fence wire still attached to the post, disappearing into the ground. Now, I started hunting on this ground, but I was always uncomfortable while I was there. I constantly felt as if I were being watched. It was kinda creepy. You could just feel something unnatural was there with you. However, having survived the NVA, I was not afraid of any creepy Indiana woodland. One rainy night, in the late 1970s, I decided to go fox hunting. I left my uncle's home and ventured out in the woods with a light, a fox call, and a shotgun. I knew the best hunting would come in the field behind the old witch's woman's farm stand, so I crossed the creek and went up the ridge to the old farm. I set up and began to use my fox call. I was not afraid. I'd learned long ago not to let my mind get the better of me. After a while, I called in a gray fox, but I was not able to get a good shot at him, so I held my fire. It was very quiet, just the sound of the rain falling. Now, I need to explain that when fox hunting, a call is used to call in the fox, and a powerful light with a red or amber lens cover is used to shine or reflect the fox's eyes, revealing the animal's position. This is a common method used by hunters everywhere. After I was convinced that the first fox I called in was not going to present a shot, I resumed calling. After several minutes, it seemed that I was hearing a noise coming from the old farmstead area. I shined my light in the direction of the pile of rubble that had once been the farm buildings, and suddenly, I realized that the light was reflecting back a pair of eyes that seemed to be 8 to 10 feet off the ground. Okay, no need to panic. Probably a raccoon up in a small tree, trying to get a better view of an animal that was in distress, a noise my call makes. Regardless of what it was, this incident spooked me, and I decided to leave. I blew my cover and removed the red lens cover from the hunting light and turned it into the direction of the elevated eyes. Now, an animal's eyes will reflect red in light, but normally reflect with a greenish tint in white light. However, the eyes of a possum will still reflect with a reddish tint. The eyes that were being reflected in my light stayed red. No big deal, just a possum. I gathered my gear and started across the field for the wooded slope to go home. Turning my light in the direction of the red reflecting eyes, they were still there, unmoving, but closer. Now, any animal whose eyes are being reflected in light will eventually move their head, causing a momentary break in the reflection. These eyes were unblinking, unmoving, except they appeared to be following me towards the woods. The scariest thing was the fact that the eyes were still about 10 feet off the ground. It was then I realized that there were no trees in the field for an animal to be in, and no Indiana owls can hover like a Harrier jet. Suddenly, this battle-tested Marine panicked and started double timing towards the woods. I found the footpath that went down to the creek crossing and started down it. After going about 40 meters into the woods, I stopped dead in my tracks. I was suddenly paralyzed with fear. I knew if I turned around that the pursuing eyeshine would be behind me. Mustering my courage, I slowly turned, shotgun at the ready, and as sure as hell, the reflection was there at the tree line, still about 10 feet off the ground. In the powerful beam of my hunting light, I should be able to see the body of whatever was following me, but all I could see were the eyes, staring, almost seeming to glow red. I was toying with the idea of shooting at what I was now sure was an apparition, but a low guttural sound, which came from the same location of the eyes, convinced me that this was not a good idea. I was overwhelmed with the feeling to get the hell out of here, so finding the feeling in my legs, I broke and ran like I never had before. I did not even use the stepping stones at the creek crossing. I just splashed through the water. I continued my pace through the scrub timber until I finally found safety in my uncle's farmyard. At this time, I heard a cry coming from the timber that I cannot duplicate or describe accurately, but it had a mocking quality to it. What did I see in those woods that night? I don't know. It wasn't anything indigenous to the Indiana woods. It was something that scared the hell out of me, more than an NVA B-40 rocket ever did. I know that I'll never go into the woods again at night. This incident happened over 20 years ago, but I can't shake the image from my mind. I was reading the many accounts of ghost hauntings and appearances, and I thought I should share mine. My senior year, my sister, my friend Mindy, George, Joey, and myself decided to go and search for ghosts in a place that is known for many ghost hauntings. I'm from San Antonio, and some of you may be familiar with the tracks school bus crash that killed several children and bus driver in the surrounding Espada Park. On the way to the tracks, there's a cemetery about a couple of blocks off the main street that leads you to the tracks. It was about 11:30 at night, and we heard about the statue of the Virgin Mary, that if you stare at her long enough, she starts to rock back and forth. This whole area is known for many ghost sightings because it is also a battlefield. The statue is located in the cemetery, near the small road that leads into the cemetery. The cemetery has a gate surrounding it and a chained entrance. Well, anyway, we parked outside the fence and sat in silence to see if this was true. Sure enough, slowly at first, the statue started rocking. She sits with her head bowed and is holding her arms as if she is carrying a baby. To our surprise, the statue started throwing her head back. We started freaking out, but weren't too scared because we had seen a ghost about 15 minutes ago, but that's another story. We sat there, and my friend noticed that the gate was completely open. I don't know how we would have missed an observation like that, since we have to pass the entrance to get to the park outside the gate to see the statue. We all decided to go in and get a better look. We were being stupid and just weren't scared enough, I guess. Slowly, George began driving, and as we kept getting closer to the statue, the harder she would rock. When we got to where we were aligned with the statue, about 10 feet, the most horrifying thing happened. The statue lifted her head and stared at us, but with no eyes and no face. It was completely black, and what made everything worse was that as soon as she looked at us, the car shut off entirely. We were in hysterics, screaming as if we were being murdered. Even George and Joey, two 18-year-old men, were screaming like girls. The car was a year old and had no problems with it. George continuously tried restarting the car, and it just would not turn on. The rest of us are looking away from the statue, and I was praying to God to start the car. Finally, what felt like an eternity, it started, and we hauled ass out of the cemetery and took a right out of the entrance, which leads us further away from the main road towards the tracks. We were in shock and decided to skip going to the tracks and go home and pray. When we got home, I noticed the TV was on and the news was blaring. It was announced that an earthquake had just hit the San Antonio area. I guess that explains what happened at the cemetery, even though I swear it was paranormal. I'm not even entirely sure what happened that night exactly, but I know it terrified me. But how do you explain the black eyes? How do you explain everything else? Maybe it was a paranormal earthquake, if that even makes sense. You know how I was talking about the ghost from earlier that I said I wouldn't mention? Well, I guess I should mention it now. A few minutes before we were heading up to the cemetery to see the statue, we saw this old guy out in the fields, just digging. As we drove by with our headlights on, we flashed towards the guy. He looked up at us and looked absolutely frightened. Either that or angry. It was hard to tell. But as he was looking up, his eyes were black. Not only that, but his eyes were so black that they were reflecting off of the car. I'm not even sure if that makes sense, but that's what we saw. We ended up driving past that area, and that's when we went into the cemetery. Now, you may dispute this and may be skeptical about what happened, but I'm telling you, honest to God, it really did happen. I know a lot of people say that, but but I swear on my life that it did. Every time I pass by that cemetery, I can't help but think of what happened that night. I don't know if I'm ready to see that thing again, once it decides to appear, but I'll tell you what, whenever someone tells me a ghost story, I'll listen and believe. We moved into a house that was about 100 years old and had not been lived in for about 20. The rumor around town was that it was haunted. I did not believe this, even though I had grown up with people that had spent nights in the house and said that they experienced it firsthand. So we moved into the house when my children were ages 5 and 8 years old. The first night in the house, I was very nervous. I could not go to sleep. When I did almost fall asleep, I heard a man's voice in my head. I know this sounds very strange, but it was like someone else's thought was in my head, and it said a man's name. I can't remember the name, only that it started with a B. We finally settled in. The girls complained of doors locking them in rooms. We had gone out of town for the weekend. My youngest daughter got a virus. When we got home, she went to bed. About 5:30 a.m., I heard what I thought was one of my children calling out for me. When I checked in on them, they were sound asleep, not even stirring. I went from my youngest daughter's room into the hall to go to my room, and I saw what I thought were car lights reflecting in my window on the stair landing. But as I watched, the lights were bobbing up and down, independent of each other. They went down the steps, turned at the landing, and continued down the steps until they disappeared through a door. Another time, at about 5:30 a.m. again, I was awakened by someone touching my leg. I thought it was one of my children, but nobody was there. I also experienced the man's voice in my head one more time. Near Halloween of the same year, I was in the car with my children when my 5-year-old complained that she always felt that someone was watching her when she was in bed. This scared me. It was time to get out. We bought a brand new house and moved out. When we had moved into the old house, I had 2 cats. They were so scared in the old house that they didn't come out from under the couch for a week. I thought this was a reaction from moving. When we moved into the new house, they were at home right away. I feel that they sensed something. After we moved out, my mother-in-law confided that she had an experience in the house while getting my children off to school. It was a foggy morning and not yet light out. She heard someone come in the house. She walked into the dining room and could see someone in what was called the parlor. She thought it was my mother, who liked to get up early and walk every morning for exercise. When she spoke my mother's name, the presence went up the steps. She thought my mother had gone up to check on the children. When she never came down, my mother-in-law went up looking for her, and no one was there. She became concerned and called my mother to make sure she was all right. My mother confirmed her calling. She said she wondered why she called so early for no apparent reason. My husband also experienced hearing what he thought was the children calling out for him, and they were asleep. For about 6 months after this, I had nightmares about the house. I hope I never experience this again. Some people think that we are crazy, but I believe that you believe that it is real. In 1972, my parents purchased a house and we moved in. I was 5 at that time. During the 5 years that we lived there, so many strange and terrible things happened. Right after moving in, we had a sense that we were not alone. Late at night, my sister and I would see a man standing over us while in our beds. I got accustomed to sleeping under the bed for years. We would lock our door, and he would unlock it. We would put things away, and he would take them back out. He was always taking things and placing them in the exact same spot a week later. We asked neighbors about the house shortly after moving in, when we arrived home from shopping, and it sounded like there was a party going on inside. When the door was opened, there was nothing, just silence. That was when we started asking questions about the property. One neighbor, who lived next door for over 50 years, told us a heart-wrenching story. It seems that a family of 4 had lived in the house in the late 1960s to the early 1970s. Man, wife, and 2 sons. In 1969, one of the boys was crossing the street and was hit and killed by a speeding car. The other child was also killed in the same spot, same time, same way, 1 year to the date. The mother was so upset that a few days later, she hung herself in the living room. The father came home to find his wife, and he shot himself in the kitchen. This was 2 years before we purchased the house, and had been on the market since the tragedies. I cannot say as to whether the spirit was content with us or not. For instance, at the age of 8 and my sister 11, she got sick and was admitted into the hospital as dead on arrival. Thank God the doctors did not give up. They saved her life and gave her back to us. She was diagnosed with encephalitis, a deadly disease during that time, and still is. She was in the bathroom when I found her that night, and in the mirror appeared a shadow of a man's head. We have since destroyed that mirror, but the shadow was never there before her sickness. Second instance, we moved and rented the house out to my aunt. One evening my uncle had went to retrieve some items he had in the garage. 2 of the items were antique shotguns. We have never been able to find shells for these 2 guns, and they're in shadow boxes now. As my uncle picked up one of the guns, the other slipped and went off. He was shot in the neck and shoulder, and almost died from the injuries. Thing is, there was no proof either gun had been fired. Police could not find any powder residue anywhere, but they concluded that the shot came from that caliber of gun. Third instance, I moved back into the house in 1986, shortly after the birth of my son. After being there a week, it was extremely hot that summer. I had a feeling something was wrong with the baby. I went into the room and noticed that it was blue and ice cold. As I rushed him to the hospital, he was coming around. At the hospital, they said nothing was wrong with him, and he sent me home. I moved that night. I only go into the house if a renter moves out. Nobody ever lives there long. I still get locked into the rooms. I feel his presence all around me, and the hair stands up on my arms. We have never been able to get a minister to go in the house. We always get told that evil lurks there. There are many other instances, but these are the ones that really bothered me the most. I'm 60 years old at the present time, but when I was in my early 20s, I married a very loving, handsome man, and we moved into our first home, which was a big red brick house in a small town. The house was separated into 2 halves, an upstairs and a downstairs. We lived in the bottom half. Soon after moving into the house, we gave birth to a beautiful daughter. Our life was fulfilled. Back then, I was still very much in love with my husband, and even today I am. And he was ever so proud of his little Joy Lynn, our daughter. Our life couldn't be better at this point. Until one day, during a hot summer, the family above us had to move due to work, and I was asked if I could clean and paint the upper half, and tried to find a new family to move in. I cleaned a little one day, and then decided to start again early morning, when the sun wasn't beating through the windows. And so I did. I started at 5 a.m. and decided to take a break and do one of my own chores that needed tending to. I left the door open that led to the upper half of the home and began to wash some clothes. When I went out in the yard to hang them, I thought nothing about my very curious 5-year-old daughter being alone in the house. I was only right outside the door. I went back in the house to make lunch for her, Before I began to clean again and called for her and got no answer, I began searching for her and she was nowhere to be found. After searching the streets, I called my husband home and then contacted the authorities. They found her daughter. She had explored through the door that was to the upper half of the house and climbed up into the attic, and when they had found her, she was dead. I was in shock. I was only outside for a short time, and she had no marks on her body to show cause, and the medical people couldn't even explain what the cause of death was. This was the hardest thing I even had to endure. One night, while lying in bed, trying to reenact the day out in my head and figure out what could have happened, my husband made a strange noise and yelled, "Did you see her?" I sat up and asked what he was seeing, and he swore my daughter had entered the room. I assured him no one was there, and that his mind was playing tricks on him because he missed her so much. That was one of my many long tearful nights, and it happened several times a week, until exactly 8 months to the day that our daughter died. When I was leaving to go to the mill, I found my husband's lifeless body lying on the basement stairs that led to the outside, and in his hands, tightly clutched, was the doll my daughter lost the day before she died. The doctors say it was a heart attack, but at the young age of 30, I think he had too much strain on his heart over the loss of his daughter. I began to blame the house. It had took my only happiness from me. I moved out shortly after, but rumors have it that the families that lived there soon after swore to see a man and a little girl walking the house in search of each other. This is my true but sad story, and someday we will be together again. As for the house, it still stands, and every so often I drive to see if I can get a glimpse of my family it took from me. Sunday, September 16th, 2001. Very early in the morning, around 6:45 a.m., I witnessed what I would speculate is my first ghost experience. Before I go and tell you what I saw, or what I think I saw, I think I should mention all the details from the night before. I live in Pennsylvania, and my fiancé lives on the border of New York and New Jersey. We were driving home from his house that night at about 12 midnight, which was about a 2-hour drive from a funeral we had attended earlier that day for his grandmother. As we were driving home, we got to telling each other about different ghost stories and urban legends. At first I was scared, getting creeped out by each story. However, after about an hour and a half of stories, I started to relax and enjoyed listening to them. When we got to my house, we decided to look for ghost stories on the internet. We got into reading in-depth stories and looking at pictures. At about 4 a.m., I put him to bed in my guest room. I still live at home with my parents, and they're very uptight about him and I sleeping together. The guest room is filled with porcelain dolls, many put in the closet due to being too freaky looking for him at night. He went to bed with the light on, again being afraid of the dolls, in the empty room. I went back to my room and stayed up for another 2.5 hours, being afraid myself. I wasn't afraid of dolls, but instead my room. My house is about 12 years old. I've been living in this house ever since I was 6. We moved in right after my 6th birthday in October. The area is new, and we were the first people to ever live there. The area before this was a dense forest, and it wasn't torn down until a year before the house was built. The area wasn't a graveyard, nor was it ever. When I was younger, I used to think the area was, so I went and did research directly where my house is located. As a child, I was sent to school in St. Anne's, a Catholic school in the area. I went to church either Saturday night or Sunday morning for years and years of my life. When I got to about 5th grade, I started to not believe in God. Around the same time, my parents were asking priests to come over and bless our house. I asked my parents nicely to keep the priests out of my room, not wanting it to be blessed. At first, my parents thought it was into the devil, but I explained that me not believing in God meant no devil either. When I reached ninth grade, I dropped Catholic school, and my parents no longer started to attend church. I know I've been going off subject, but I guess I should give you the background information before the details. I didn't want to go to bed at all, but I knew I should, so I waited until the sun came up and crawled into bed. My room is the hottest room in the entire house. It is so small. By the time I had gone to bed, I'd gotten so cold that I had to sleep fully dressed with a sweatshirt on. I never even did this in the winter. When I was under the covers, I looked up at the ceiling. Maybe it was my imagination, due to all the fright I'd been going through, but it looked like something was above me. I started to doze off for a second and looked straight up at the ceiling. What I noticed was absolutely terrifying. I noticed a spider, only had a human face. It was translucent, and it looked at me with piercing eyes. The eyes were even red. I closed my eyes yet again, and when I reopened them, everything seemed fine, and there was nothing on the ceiling. I've never in my life been this scared, and I've never in my life imagined things, even when I was scared. I closed my eyes and refused to open them. I fell asleep, from what I recall, a few minutes after. Later the next day, at around 8 p.m., Derek and I had been talking about what happened the previous night. We were both hungry, so I decided to go downstairs and go find something for him and I to snack on. When I came back up, we started eating, and he casually drops a line. He told me that while that was happening, last night he saw a person in the distance while the door was open in the hallway. He said he knew it was a ghost because it was transparent, but not transparent enough to notice the spiders crawling all over this person. He noticed it for about 10 seconds, and then it faded away. He was absolutely terrified, even though he seemed really nonchalant, telling me the story. I could see it in his eyes. A split second later, he felt a cold draft enter the room. Although there was no windows open at the moment, before this, I never really believed in ghosts the way I do now. However, maybe we were both scared and imagined this. And one day though, everything that was told in this email is true and exact. Nothing was exaggerated. I would really like some help and hope maybe someone could answer my questions. Please tell me if you think we're both seeing things, or if maybe our willingness to believe has brought out a spirit. Whatever the case, it was horrifying, and I do not want to experience the spider ever again. I'm an agnostic, or truth seeker. My wife is not, but both of us are open-minded people. We also believe that spirits exist, as well as ghosts, and my wife considers it creepy, while I simply remain fascinated with them. We moved into an apartment just after we were married, in 1999. I believe that there are ghosts and residual energies in various places in our apartment. The place is the standard apartment layout, and every once in a while, night or day, doesn't matter what time, she and I, or both, would hear the sounds of footsteps on carpet going down a short hallway. These were not boots in the hardwood footsteps, but more like bare feet on plush carpet. We felt that the ghost was female and very sweet. She would just walk down the hallway towards the bedrooms. If I were in one of the bedrooms, I would always have a small feeling of happiness go through me after I heard her coming. The way you would feel if someone smiled at you. Occasionally, we would feel her watching us from the front room or back bedroom. Evidently, the hallway was where her domain was. There were never cold spots, but my wife would occasionally feel the lady next to her when she walked from the bedrooms to the front room. The lady made my wife feel rather creeped out. However, she startled me once when she came running into the bedroom eyes wide, and told me that the lady moaned in her ear, as if trying to say something to her. So for the sake of my wife, we stood in the hallway and asked the lady nicely, but firmly, that she could remain, but to not make her presence known to us. We also informed her about the light and how she could enter into it. Since we had no more occurrences with her, in the small bedroom, there's either residual energy or a passive ghost. I feel watched when I'm in there, and it's usually 10 to 15 degrees cooler, even with the afternoon sun spilling in. I don't think my wife feels it, and no one else does either, but I felt it so strongly, so I placed a micro cassette recorder in there with a sensitive mic and recorded for the duration of the 30-minute tape. The only odd things I've heard on the tape were an occasional whistle that changes in octave. The second only lasts for a half a second, but it's an audible, breathy whistle that goes up an octave, like first part of a wolf whistle. That was interesting, and I'd dismiss it if it weren't for some of our possessions being misplaced that suddenly appear in odd places. Our truck keys suddenly disappeared this morning without a trace anywhere. The truck was searched over twice, and the apartment was searched. So I made duplicates at Home Depot and gave them to my wife, who used them to drive to the doctor's appointment. When the appointment was over, we walked back out to the truck and opened the door with a duplicate key. There on the driver's side seat was the original set of keys that were missing. She would have felt them under her bum if they'd been there before. She called me at work in hysteria, telling me all about it. I don't mind ghosts being around. I consider them friends, or at least I try to make friends with them. They are, in fact, just spirits without bodies. Some are angry, some are nice, and even some are jokers. When you come across one, you should respect him or her just like you would a complete stranger. Make friends with it, or ask it to leave if you wish. But don't disrespect ghosts because of childhood, Halloween stories. They are intelligent humans who are a bit confused about where they are. If you happen to have one around you, simply ask it to walk into the light where friends and loved ones await them. This experience is not that exciting to hear about. I do not wish to embellish it with creepy anecdotes or a mysterious plot, but nevertheless, this is how it went. I attended Hagengrove Military Academy in Chanton, Virginia, a town that in itself is stuck in time. It is the home of racists, bigots, and sadists who have inherited land from their ancestors. It is not a place in which I would suggest visiting. Having said that, I used to make a trip with some of my classmates in a beer store, 57's, which was an hour-long walk through pasture and woods from the campus. We never left with the intent to be caught by school officials, one of which, Captain Stout, a double Medal of Honor veteran, who is as sneaky and stealthy as anyone on the planet. The penalty of being caught was very high. We did not mention this experience to anyone who was not present. It surely would have spread. We were on our way back from 57's at about 1 o'clock in the morning, a little buzz from cheap beer with the intent to distribute alcohol to other students, when the three of us, mainly my roommate and best friend, stopped dead in our tracks for no reason. I'll remember the next sequence of events until the day I die. We heard the unmistakable war cries of rebel soldiers on the charge. It is a sound somewhat akin to imprisoned tribesmen intent on killing you. From atop a hill, directly in front of us, through the trees, came 30 to 40 purely solid figures charging, apparently unconcerned with us. We hit the forest floor and did not make a sound as we witnessed a battle, first 10 or 12 volleys of gunfire, and finally hand-to-hand combat, and then retreat. It is pointless for me to explain every troop movement I witnessed. Just use your imagination, and you should understand. The whole incident lasted no longer than 2 to 3 minutes, but the cries of those men will haunt me forever. I live in the town of Anaconda, Montana, and I used to work at the Copper Bowl. We all used to joke around about Wilbur, the previous owner, who haunted the place. At first it was just little things that would happen. Casino machines would all of a sudden have credits on them when no one was there, which could be a mechanical malfunction. Things would move from one place to another, but nothing was as horrifying as what happened one Saturday morning. It was earlier in the morning, and it was just the cook and I. He was telling me about the reflection of a woman he had seen a few nights before in one of the windows, but when the spot where she was supposed to be was investigated, no one was there. These kind of scarier stories were becoming more and more commonplace, and we knew that Wilbur wasn't alone. That morning, we had gone over to the bowling alley, which is next door. It was always dark in there until the owners came, and always cold. In the dark, you could hear someone walking across the boards, which makes a very distinct sound. Now, what I mean by walking across the boards is that someone is walking in the gutters or on the lanes themselves. You could hear the footsteps coming towards us, but there was no one there. You could also hear the jingling of keys. A little while later, we were alone in the restaurant, and you could hear things next door getting louder. Not just footsteps this time, but other noises that we just couldn't explain. The cook had to go over to the bowling alley to get ice and was gone for what seemed like a very long time, so I went over to find him. As I walked through the door, there was a really intense feeling, one that I've only had a few times in my life, and it was the feeling of get the heck out of there, but I had to find my coworker. When I called his name the first time, I got no answer, so I walked up towards the bar. As I walked up the stairs, I heard what sounded like a gurgling noise that comes from deep inside the back of the throat, and I got the chills. I called his name again, and this time he answered me, but it sounded very faint. Again I called his name, and it seemed to be as loud as it should be, considering he was only 4 feet from me. A little while later, we went over there again to have our cigarettes, and I saw a black figure at the other end of the alley walk across. My coworker saw the panic in my face and turned around. He then turned to me and told me we had to get the hell out of there. I found out that Wilbur had died when he drowned on a fishing trip. Needless to say, I quit not long after that. My better half and I were looking for a larger apartment to rent. Because he works mornings and I work afternoons, I ended up doing a lot of our house hunting alone. I went to look at around 5 different houses and apartments one day. They were all far too generic, little boxes in apartment complexes, until the last one. This last house was an old mill house, made into a duplex. It was huge. The ceilings were 15 feet. The rooms were massive. It was a great house, about 9 years old, and oh so cool. My boyfriend came to look at it the next day and also liked it, so we moved in. It was little things at first, an odd pounding on the wall that we attributed to our rambunctious neighbor, cold winds that we thought were just the usual drafts of an old house, but the cat, we couldn't explain the cat. Our kitty is a smart little beastie, more so than the average feline. He wouldn't go upstairs without one of us. If he was asleep on the bed and he left the room, he would go streaking past you down the stairs. He would sit and stare at something in the corner. He would leap up from a nap and chase his tail, like someone had pulled it. We didn't even really think about it. We figured the cat was weirded out by the move. Then more concrete, odd things began to happen. I would see little figures out of the corner of my eye, quick shadows that were gone before I could turn my head. Or I would hear laughter, but it would vanish just as quickly. Sometimes I would hear crying as I walked up the stairs, but these things were always short and soft enough that I would think it was a trick of my mind. My boyfriend and I were watching a movie one night when something happened that convinced me I wasn't insane or overly imaginative. My boyfriend, who does not believe at all and is incredibly pragmatic, suddenly stopped the movie. He asked me if I heard that. What? I replied. He looked at me and said, children screaming. I hadn't heard it. I could see how upset he was. And more odd things have happened since then. My boyfriend and I love kids, especially me. It's a running joke that I'm a baby magnet. Kids love me. We have several friends who bring their young children over to visit, or for me to babysit. So I have toys all over the house. Our kitchen and living room are connected by a doorway with no door, so you can see straight through. I was making a tuna fish sandwich a couple of days ago and happened to glance into the living room. A small, brightly colored ball rolled across the floor. At first, I thought the cat must be playing with it, and then I realized the cat was sitting next to me, hoping to catch some floor-bound tuna. I was the only one home. My boyfriend swears that he saw a blonde-haired kid in our kitchen, hiding under the table. I was babysitting our friend's toddler that day, and he figured it was Mickey. So he snuck over, planning to lift up the tablecloth and play peekaboo. But when he lifted the tablecloth, no one was there. Mikey and I were 2 blocks away at the park. I know I've gone through all this setup, and nothing really freaky's happened, so here's the clincher. It happened this morning. That's why I'm writing this now. I woke up late. My boyfriend had gone to work, and I was planning to laze around the house and maybe do some yard work. I laid down on our couch and decided to watch a movie, and I apparently dozed off. I woke up because someone was crawling onto the couch. Seriously. To anyone who has kids or spends a lot of time with them, you know what this is like. You're napping and feel tiny hands on the couch. Then a little body crawls up and snuggles down next to you. This has happened so many times that at first it didn't even faze me. Then I realized that none of the munchkins I'd take care of were in the house. No one was in the house, and when I sat up, the weight was gone and no one was there. None of this scares me. I rented this house because I told my better half that it felt happy, like a home. The only thing I can come up with is that the children of whatever mill worker lived in this house are still around, and that's okay. I hope they like us in our home. I'd rather have happy little ghosts than not so nice other ones. I'm so glad this site is here, and I can tell someone about these events. Our friends just laugh. Great work. I've had a few ghostly occurrences happen to me, but 2 really stand out. I call it Lady with the Long Black Hair. When I was a little girl, growing up in Somerville, Massachusetts, I was around 3, I think. I would wake up every night because of a bad dream. I would then make my way to my parents' room to sleep for the remainder of the night. I would have to pass through the kitchen to get there. Lights were out, but there was some light coming in the windows from the street lights. I would see her, sitting on the kitchen counter, up against the wall, by one of the windows, a lady with the long black hair, which is how I always referred to her. She was dressed in a long black dress, pale-faced but shadowy, with illuminated, green eyes. She would just be sitting there and looking right at me. It always took my breath away. I was so afraid of her. I would inch my way towards my mother's room with my back against the wall, never taking my eyes off her. Her eyes followed my progress across the room. I always thought, she's going to jump off the counter and get me, but that never happened. Years later, my mom told me she had strange things happen to her in that house too, but that's another story. In another story, my Nana came to visit me. Years later, living as an adult in Hampton, Virginia. One night, I was awakened by something. When I opened my eyes and looked around, I was startled to see my Nana sitting in bed with me. Nana had died 6 months earlier. It was kind of scary because she was gray and just slightly transparent. Also, she had a shocked look on her face, almost like she was the scared one. Then in my head, I heard her voice saying, "Shh, go back to sleep," which I did. The next day, I remembered it all quite clearly, and thinking on it, I feel like she had been surprised that I had woken up and was looking right at her. I don't think she bargained on that when she come to visit me. Hey, my name is Tyler, and this is the story of my sightings of the ghost in my uncle's house. I moved to Bend, Oregon to live and work with my uncle, and I slept upstairs where nothing happened at all for the first 3 months. Then my dad and 2 brothers moved in also, so I had to move downstairs. Well, downstairs had like its own living room, a bathroom in the bedroom with its door next to the stairs. Well, we used to hear 2 sets of footsteps upstairs walking around when there was no one up there. Sometimes we would think it was my brother and his friends, but when my little brother went up to check the door, it was locked and they were still out. One night, my brother fell asleep on the couch, and when he woke up, he heard a very loud scream, like a woman being killed downstairs. When the scream happened, our cat ran up the stairs, hit the hardwood floors, and ran right into the room, under the bed. Also, right up the stairs, our fridge faced a window with the oven right in front of the fridge door. There was a magnet calendar on the freezer door, and one night, while watching television, me and my brother and my dad were scared when we heard a loud bang in the kitchen, and then the calendar was thrown hard down the stairs and hit the door downstairs. Thing about it is that there is no way that the calendar could have went downstairs at the angle it was. The thing that made me really believe in ghosts, though, was this one night, after my dad went to bed, I watched some TV, and it was summertime out, so it was hot, and I decided to sleep on the floor. When I was about to fall into sleep, I heard a light chuckle behind me, which I thought was my dad. But when I looked behind me, there was absolutely no one. I tried to go to sleep again, and the same thing happened, and I got a little angry. Well, again, I was about to fall asleep when I had the feeling that someone was looking at me. When I opened my eyes, there was a gray male figure about 6 feet long and a dark figure about 5'10" standing right next to me. And when I looked at them both, they both looked back at me. I got so scared that I closed my eyes and prayed that they would leave. And when I opened my eyes again, they were both walking. Again, I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, they turned the corner and went up the stairs. I picked up my pillow and ran into my dad's room. He woke up right when I got into his room, and when he asked what happened, I told him in a very shaken voice that I saw a ghost. Right when that happened, we both heard 2 sets of footsteps right above our heads, and the door opened and closed with a lot of force. After that night, I believed in ghosts, and there's nothing in the future that'll ever change my mind. Hi, my story happened a long time ago. I was 17, and it was the evening of the 1989 earthquake here in Northern California. I was staying at a family friend's house for the night. I had known them for several years, and they'd always told ghost stories while we would camp. The husband's brother had just died when he was 5 years old. He got hit by a car. He said he thinks that his brother was still around. They still lived on the same property that he grew up on. Anyway, to get to the story, that evening, we all went to bed. They had a small house and had me sleep in the kids' room, and the kids slept in the living room. Everyone was turned in for the night. All of a sudden, the lights started flickering. The dad yelled for the kids to stop messing around. It wasn't them. We all ended up getting out of bed. The lights continued to flicker and then turn off completely. We turned the light switches on, and nothing. We looked outside, and other people's homes were still lit up, so it wasn't a power outage. I just figured with the earthquake and all, who knows, I wasn't scared at the time. We all went back to bed and giggled a little and made a few jokes about the ghost. I laid back down, and before long, the lights started up again, and then the drawers in the bathroom started opening and closing, slamming hard. At this point, I was scared. I ran into the master bedroom and told them I wasn't sleeping by myself. I thought I would sleep on the floor at the foot of the bed. We were all a little scared. All of a sudden, the most horrible, inhuman sound came. Like I said, it was a small house. It sounded like the home had surround sound. It came from every corner of the house. This loud, guttural scream or moan. It was a long moment, and then it all stopped. I sat there and cried. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I couldn't wait to get out of there. I told them in the morning that I would never be back to their home. I felt that whatever it was, didn't like an outsider in the house. I look back at that night and wonder about it. I lost contact with the family. It has been close to 20 years now. At the time, it made me a firm believer in the paranormal. Now as I get older and am more skeptical, I can't help but wonder if it's some kind of joke. I don't see how. At the time, I don't even think there was such thing as a surround sound. And that is the only way that sound could have come from the house. It was as if the house itself was screaming. That is the only paranormal experience that I've ever had. Just thought I would share it. Thanks. My friend Helen and I had been in our local pub for most of the evening. We had been drinking cola all night, but decided to walk down to another one close by, as there was a band that we liked that was playing there. The town that we lived in is quiet and unassuming, so we thought nothing of walking through the cemetery that was on the way to the other pub. You're probably thinking, oh, here we go, another cemetery story. It was right in the middle of the two pubs, so it was the usual quick walk. It was around 9:30 p.m. on a Sunday night in October 1998, so it was pretty dark. We chatted and walked down the path and into the cemetery, not giving it a second thought. All of a sudden, Helen grabbed my arm and froze on the spot. "What the heck is that?" she gasped. Thinking she was trying to scare me, I just laughed and looked over to where she was pointing. I could feel her shaking as she held on to me. To help you picture the scene, the path runs directly through the middle of the cemetery, with graves on both sides, the church to the left, and a row of cottages just the other side of the graves, and a little hedge to the right. To my horror, there was something very large, tall and black, making its way along the small road, which runs along the side of the cottages. We're only about 15 yards away, but there was absolute silence. No footsteps, breathing, or noise of any kind. The thing was sort of gliding along at a steady pace, as we couldn't see the bottom of it because of the graves in a small hedge. We couldn't see any legs or anything, but the way it moved looked like it was on a bike. We both stood, rooted to the spot, and watched it for around 30 seconds. It moved around the row of cottages and down a small alley that runs along the side of the library. The odd thing was that it was huge, much taller than the downstairs windows of the cottages, and it was a sort of square shape. It's very hard to describe, but it was definitely not a person. It made absolutely no noise and moved very softly and smoothly. We were terrified. When it had gone, we just looked at each other and ran back to the pub. We told a couple of our friends, but they just laughed at us and said that we were seeing things. But we knew what we'd seen, and it really frightened us. We're not the kind of girls that scare easily and are very level-headed. On occasions we still mention it, We even went along there in daylight to try and find a plausible explanation, even trying to work out how tall it must have been, but we never came up with anything. Welcome to this edition of Phantom of Darkness's narrations. Thank you for joining us as we commence on this journey through epic proportions. If you subscribe to my channel, you could actually not subscribe to my channel and get some value out of not subscribing out of it if you don't like my channel. That would make things a lot better. Anyway, guys, forget what I just said. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. I really appreciate your support. I know I've been kind of crazy with my upload schedule in terms of not uploading on time, so I don't know why I called it crazy, but I've just not been getting out videos as much as possible because, well, I don't know. I just don't know. I gotta get better, though. No excuses making, though. Seriously, guys, though, go ahead and like, comment, share, and subscribe to this video. I added a bunch of new stock footage, and no, that strange blue guy was definitely not my face. If you see my face before, you already know. I already did a face reveal and all that good stuff. So you guys are well aware of what my face looks like if you're a long-term subscriber. If you're new, consider subscribing, hitting the share button, and all that jazz. But really, I'm not doing jazz. I'm doing opera. So, whatever. Guys, I'm going to sign out here, but before I do, just wanted to say there has been a mass demonetization of channels lately, and I could be next, who knows. Hopefully my channel doesn't get demonetized. Of course, that would totally crush me if that were to happen, but there's no way to predict the future, so I'm just hoping and praying that everything will be okay for my channel. But if you guys want to support the cause, in the description of this video and every other video that I have on YouTube, there's going to be a Patreon donation page for me if you choose to, donate to Patreon for me, obviously. You don't have to do it. No, it's not required. It's not your job to donate and make sure that I get a donation or anything like that. But it is there because, in case my channel goes belly up and something happens to it, then, you got the donation page in case you guys want to support me. Anyway, guys, that's not important, though. I'm going to sign out. Thanks so much again for listening to my stories. Love you guys so very much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Love ya.